Asia transformed massively in just one century. From a region carved up by colonial empires to the powerhouse of today's emerging multipolar world. BRICS, the SCO, ASEAN. So many of the key pillars of the new global order are now anchored right here in Asia. To discuss the continent's stunning success and its future, I'm joined today by the prolific Singaporean diplomat and academic Dr. Kishore Mahbubani, the author of Has China Won? The Asian 21st Century and Living the Asian Century. Dr. Mahbubani, welcome.
My pleasure. By the way, you can call me ambassador or professor, but I'm not doctor.
I'm sorry. I read that video.
It's okay.
Actually.
Yeah.
Ambassador Mahbubani, which is very nice because you served actually in the United Nations twice, Singapore's ambassador to the UN.
Yes.
And can you tell me a bit, is my assessment that Asia is really going to be one of the new centers of this multipolarity? Do you share that assessment?
No, Asia is not just going to become one center, it's going to become the center. But of course, within Asia, there'll be multiple poles, by the way. Asia itself will be multipolar, not just part of a multipolar world. And certainly, the key point I emphasize in my writings is that the 200 years of Western domination of world history have been an aberration. Because from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies of the world were always those of, China and India. Mm-hmm. So it's only in the last 200 years that Europe took off and North America took off. But this Western domination was always an aberration. It has come to an end, and it's ending very fast. And I always give one statistic to illustrate this. If you compare the combined economy of the European Union with China, in the year 2000, the combined economy of the European Union was 8 times bigger than China, right? Today, they're about the same size.
Yeah.
And by 2050, Europe will be half the size of China. And, for the Europeans, they got to understand that when you go from being 8 times bigger than China towards becoming half the size of China in 50 years, you got to learn to treat China with more respect. Instead of making these condescending comments that European leaders still make about China, which is crazy.
It is. It somehow doesn't leave the European mindset that they still believe everything rotates around them. But now reality is catching up very fast. One of our colleagues, Glenn Deason, made this argument in a book that Europe needs to get back to this idea that it is really just the Western Peninsula of Eurasia. Do you believe that this will have to come sooner or later, this kind of reintegration of Europe into Asia?
Certainly, I think it's important for Europeans to understand that if you look objectively at the world today, Europe represents the past. I mean, it does, by the way, represent a beautiful past. And so I actually believe that Europe is going to become, in some ways, a very nice museum for the world. The United States of America represents the present. But Asia represents the future. That's where all the future growth is going to come from. And it's better for the Europeans to adapt to this change in advance rather than to resist it. And certainly, acceptance means that you got to make real concessions, for example, in places like IMF and the World Bank, and not insist that the European voting share must still remain disproportionately high.
What do you think stands in the way of this order now changing peacefully? Because we are seeing currently a lot of violence. We see a genocide in Gaza, we see the war in Ukraine, we see preparations of the United States to go to war with Venezuela. What is it in your view that makes this moment now so violent?
Well, I think I would say actually overall, I mean, certainly the war in Ukraine is a tragedy, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is illegal. It should be condemned. But at the same time, it's a war that could have been prevented if the Europeans had shown some degree of geopolitical competence. And the European geopolitical incompetence is also responsible for this war, because the Europeans completely ignored some real and legitimate security concerns of Russia in the build-up to the war. And certainly the Gaza war is a tragedy, and certainly a war in Venezuela would also be a tragedy. But if you look at Asia by and large, what is stunning is that China has managed to grow its economy dramatically, as I have just demonstrated, becoming the same size of European Union, despite being 1/8 the size in the year 2000. But China has achieved this rise peacefully. And normally when great powers emerge, they never emerge peacefully. I mean, Graham Allison in his book, Destined for War, has said that Americans should not wish that China should be like America, because when America emerged as a great power in the 1890s, it was very violent. It declared wars on Spain, conquered Philippines, conquered some of the neighbors. So clearly, China's peaceful emergence has been a gift to the world. And that's why the West should appreciate this and accept the fact that China's rise has been peaceful, instead of trying to thwart China's rise and therefore create a lot of problems for the world.
Do you, from your experience also as a diplomat who had to interact a lot with the Europeans and the Americans, the West in general, do you think they can do that? Do you think they're able to jump over their own shadow and actually say, like, okay, fine, this time we're going to try to approach others on eye level?
Sorry, repeat that again.
Do you think the West is able to finally realize that they have to approach others on eye level and not through this insane kind of berating them constantly for all alleged things?
Well, I mean, I would say the more thoughtful people in the West understand that the world has changed, and the West has got to stop talking down to Asians, for example, right? But many of the leaders cannot admit it, You remember President Joe Biden famously said when he was president, he said that the Chinese have the goal of becoming the number one power in the world. But he said, it ain't gonna happen on my watch, No American president wants to be president of the United States when it becomes the number two power in the world. So, that shows that a sense of lack of reality, because at some point in time, I don't know when, Chinese economy will become the largest economy in the world. And it's better to prepare for it in advance and accept it, rather than to keep denying it. Earlier on, for example, I mentioned the voting shares in IMF. Even though both EU and China are about the same size, they have about 17-18% of the world's GNP. But the EU share of IMF voting shares is 27%, and China's share is 6%. Now, in theory, according to the voting shares in IMF are supposed to represent your share of the global GNP. So EU has got to cut down its voting share from 27% to 17%, and China has got to increase its share from 6% to 17%. And then you have a voting share that reflects the world of today, not the world of yesterday. But that's a concrete example of how the Europeans are refusing to accept the fact that, Asia has risen and you got to adapt and change.
Do you think it is more realistic to try to nudge the West to actually adapt these institutions, or does it make more sense to just build new ones? Because it seems to me that, especially within BRICS, the idea at the moment is to let's build the new infrastructure and just, if the West ever wants to join, maybe in the future they can, but let's go ahead.
Well, I think most Asian states actually, surprisingly, are happy to live with the current global order that was created by the West in 1945 at the end of World War II. So you look at all the major global institutions, the United Nations family of institutions like World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, IMF, World Bank, you name it. They were all created by the West at the peak of its power at the end of World War II. Now, in theory, with Asia rising, Asia can say, hey, we don't want these Western institutions. We want to create our own. But actually, the Asians want to keep these institutions. But of course, these institutions got to adapt and accept Asia's return. So, for example, within the UN, you have a UN Security Council, in theory, it has 15 members, but in practice, as Singapore discovered when we were members of the council in 2001, 2002, that there are actually 5 members who control the council, the P5, and which is, of course, United States, Russia, China, UK, France. And the 10 members are the elected members are observers, basically. The council is controlled by the 5. But, that's not a bad thing to have a veto, 5 permanent members, with a veto. But you got to represent the great powers of today and not the great powers of yesterday. That's what the Security Council was designed to have. And so, for example, you take UK, for example, right? And I mean, I'll compare UK with India, okay? And the reason I compare UK with India is that 100 years ago, the British could rule India effortlessly. It's shocking that 100,000 Englishmen could rule over 300 million Indians. Amazing, right? Now, that world is, of course, it won't happen again. But even as recently as the year 2000, the British economy was 3.5 times bigger than the Indian economy. Today, of course, the Indian economy is bigger, but by 2050, the Indian economy will be 4 times bigger than the British economy. Now, when that day comes, it will be absurd to have the UK as a permanent member of the UN Security Council and India not as a member. So if the British want to be gracious about it, the British should say, okay, India is now a much more powerful country than me. The British should graciously give up their permanent seat in the UN Security Council to India. And when I wrote this article for the Financial Times, I thought the Financial Times wouldn't print it. To my surprise, they printed it. So I think the more thoughtful British realize that the time has come for the British to give up their seat in the UN Security Council to India. But that's the sort of thing, these are the sort of changes you need to make. So you keep the institution of the UN, but you change the composition.
But in order to do that, the Brits would have to do it voluntarily, and actually the other 4 Security Council members would have to accept that too, because the United States could veto it. France could veto it if they said, like, no, you're not leaving the club. Is it realistic to believe that the institution, that these declining powers have the ability to actually say, like, fine, we need, for the greater good of everybody, we need to disempower ourselves and empower the others? Because we don't often see that in world politics, do we?
Yeah, you're right. In France could veto, and United States could veto. You're right, but at the same time, they also got to figure out that the challenge to the UN Security Council, the danger for the UN Security Council is that they may keep their present composition, but they can lose their credibility. No one will listen to them. Say, who are you? Who do you represent? Why should you British still be in the council? So to keep its credibility, it's got to change the composition. Mm-hmm. So that's the dilemma that the current members of the P5 have. Do they keep the composition and lose their credibility, or change the composition and gain and keep their credibility? But what I have done is, in my book, The Great Convergence, I've also suggested a comprehensive formula for reforming the UN Security Council. I call it the 777 formula. So you will have 7 permanent members in the UN Security Council. And then the 7 will be, of course, United States, Russia, China. The European Union will have 1 seat combined. And then you will have, as the new members, India, Brazil, and either South Africa or Nigeria from Africa. So 7 permanent members. And then you will have 7 semi-permanent members. Because, for every new member that wants to come in, right, there's always a neighbor that says, why not me, right? When Brazil wants to come in, Argentina says, why not me? When India wants to come in, Pakistan says, why not me? Right? So for every member that wants to come in, there's a member that says, why not me? So for the countries that say, why not me, can become 7 semi-permanent members of the Security Council, whereby they rotate every 8 years and come back in. So they get something also. They also benefit. And then you have 7 elected members. So I believe something along the lines of 777 can work. In fact, the Quincy Institute of Washington, D.C. Is trying to adapt my formula and suggest it as a way of reforming the UN Security Council.
In order for that to pass, you would need to change the UN Charter, right? And that would have to pass through the GA and the General Assembly and the Security Council. So it would need, for the General Assembly, for it to pass, it would need just a simple majority or more?
I think probably a 2/3 majority. But I think if you have a formula that makes a lot of winners from this formulas, you see, right now the current formulas will change, create losers and not winners from a lot of people. But the formula I've suggested creates about 30 to 40 winners from this formula. And so the winners therefore have a stake in voting for it.
How to sell it to those who would need to agree to decrease their relative
So actually,
power?
you know what? For the smaller states, it's actually better for them if they don't have to compete with the middle powers in the UN Security Council. Because if you look carefully at the history of the UN Security Council, some of the middle powers like Brazil, for example, keeps coming back every 8 years, every 10 years, And then the smaller states don't have a chance to get elected. They have to run against the Brazils and the Indias and Japans and all that. But under my formula, the middle powers in a separate category. So the smaller states will have to compete among themselves. And they have more scope to join there, So there'll be more space and if you look at it effectively, there'll be more opportunities for smaller states to get elected under my formula.
There's no question the UN needs reform. Your formula would be a good idea. The central question is how to do it, how to get it through. And I wonder if ASEAN as well, I mean, Singapore being one of the key parts of ASEAN, also has some lessons to offer on how a multipolar world can be structured where it's not all about just top-down decision making, but a consensus model. What do you think about that?
Well, I think ASEAN is definitely a role model for the world. Because, we haven't discussed some of the other changes happening in the world. And I always say that the new world that is coming is what I call a 3M world, And the 3M meaning that it will be multi-civilizational, multipolar, and multilateral. And the reason why the world needs to study ASEAN is that ASEAN is the most successful multi-civilizational club in the world. In fact, no other region of the world is as diverse as Southeast Asia is. Indeed, among the close to 700 million people in Southeast Asia, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, you have Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and you also have lots of communists in Southeast Asia. So it is by far the most diverse region of planet Earth. Yet it has preserved itself as an oasis of peace and prosperity. So what ASEAN has done is ASEAN has provided a multi-civilizational laboratory for the world so you can understand how different civilizations can live with each other in peace. And that's what the 21st century is going to be all about, because the Western civilization has got to learn to live in peace with stronger Chinese civilization, stronger Indian civilization, stronger Islamic civilization. And the reason why ASEAN is the only one that can offer a model, because if you look at the European Union, for example, the European Union has been around much longer than ASEAN, but it still remains a Christian club. And, Turkey has applied to join for, 30, 40 years now. And the fact that the European Union cannot even admit one Islamic member shows that the European Union is psychologically not preparing itself for a multi-civilizational world, but ASEAN is teaching the world how to live in a multi-civilizational world.
One other thing that the West seems unwilling to give up is this thinking in black and white and friend and enemy, in ally or adversary. But ASEAN and Asia in general, it doesn't go that route. The rest of the world doesn't go the way of forming more and more alliances. How do you see the security structure actually? That what can we learn about how Asia organized its security structure?
Well, one thing you notice that, relatively speaking, in Asia, the major powers are not building alliance structures. So China is not building an alliance structure. India is not building an alliance structure. Indonesia is not building an alliance structure. Of course, some Asian states are allies of the West, of United States. I mean, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Thailand. But at the same time, they're also pragmatic. Even though they're allies of the United States, they're still keeping up their good ties with China. Although, as you know, right now, Japan and China seem to be having a very difficult patch. But they've gone through difficult patches before and they've come out of it. So I hope they'll come out of this difficult patch too. But the notion of creating exclusive alliances is not part of the Asian tradition, because we are much more inclusive. We say that we'd rather have people who are different from us in the same club, because we have to live with people who are different from us and not similar to us. So within ASEAN, for example, the West, for example, under the Western system, you have to be a democracy before you can join the Western alliance, right? But, some of the states in ASEAN are democracies, some are not democracies. We say, okay, you choose your political system. We don't pass judgment on it. We accept you for what you are, and we will live with you, And that's the acceptance of diversity is a big asset of Asia, rather than the Western tradition of creating like-minded alliances.
Do you think the pressure on Southeast Asia and other regions will increase to actually, have more balanced security ties, meaning like less eggs in one single basket? Like Singapore, it seems to be especially like a bit in this tension of like, are we an integral part of the US alliance system or are we not? Do you think, in my view, I think it would the pressure will increase for places to be more neutral in the sense of having more partners. But how do you see it?
Well, I think certainly in the case of the most Asian countries, for example, I mean, there's no question. My book Has China Won, which you mentioned, tries to explain why the US-China contest will definitely accelerate over the next 10 to 20 years. This is normal because the world's number one power will never give up its position gracefully. It will always try to push down the number one emerging power. So the fact that the United States is pushing down China is logical, predictable behavior of any number one power. So we should not be surprised by it. But what's interesting is that, unlike in the case of the Cold War, when the United States was very successful in recruiting allies, both in advanced European countries and also among developing countries. I mean, in the Cold War, countries like Indonesia, Pakistan, Egypt, and to some extent even China were allies of the United States in the Cold War. But this time around, in the contest between the United States and China, almost all the major countries in the world, especially in the global south, have said, we're not taking sides. We want to be friends with the United States of America. We want to be friends with China. And I think that's the pattern. And certainly among the 11 ASEAN countries, they have made their position very clear. They want to be friends with the United States and they want to be friends with China, and they don't want to take sides. And that in general also reflects the position of the global south countries too.
There's this, to me, very telling very, very telling video about the foreign minister of India, Mr. Jaishankar, in a interview about 1.5-2 years ago, when the Western interviewer really pressed him on when push comes to shove, will you be with the West or with China? Will you be with the West or will you be with China? It seems not to register in the West that you can have friendship or not defined relationships with several sides. Do you also observe that?
Yes, certainly. And India will emerge as a strong independent pole in a multipolar world. I already gave you the example of how India's economy is growing very rapidly compared to the British economy. And in the case of India, it's already the 5th largest economy in the world. And very soon, within 4 to 5 years, it will become the 3rd largest economy in the world. And so clearly 10 years from now, you'll be United States and China will be the number 1, number 2 positions, and India will be the number 3 position. And so there's no reason for India to align itself with either the United States or with China, because it's big enough, strong enough to be an independent third pole. And frankly, the rest of the world will be happy to see India as an independent third pole, because if the independent third pole doesn't take sides, it provides political cover for other countries also not to take sides in this US-China contest.
Very concrete question, but do you think it is about time that we start reforming a very old part of international law called the law of neutrality in order to adapt it to this modern version of being multi-aligned?
Well, I think I don't think that they will be necessarily neutral, They will be, in my view, the word non-aligned is still very much more accurate, because on some issues, clearly, countries will work closely with the United States, for example, because the United States is still a leading country in many areas, and the world will still have to work with the United States. And in other areas, they'll work closely with China. So they're not necessarily being neutral. They're being non-aligned and willing to work with everybody.
The interesting thing is non-alignment was never codified in international law, at least not in any way similar to the way neutrality was codified. Do you think the UN should work on non-aligned principles and norms in order to make them more useful?
Well, I think what's more important is for the states to show their positions in their behavior, right? And behavior is much more important as an indication. So, for example, the European states, for example, right? They could have also chosen to be an independent pole. And in the geopolitical contest between the United States and China, they could have chosen to be friends with the United States and be friends with China, right? And that will be a sensible thing for Europe to do, because in many ways, in the long run, the biggest challenge for Europe is not going to come from Russia. Russian tanks are not going to invade Germany or France anymore. In fact, the biggest challenge to Europe is going to come from the demographic explosion in Africa, right? And, in the year 1950, Europe's population was double that of Africa's. Today, Africa's population is 2.5 times bigger than Europe's. By 2100, Africa's population could be 10 times bigger than Europe. So Europe has got a very important vested interest in the economic development of Africa. Because and so every dollar invested in Africa is a gift to Europe, because it creates jobs for Africans to stay in Africa. So when China is now the biggest investor in Africa. So when China invests in Africa, Europe should send China a thank you note and say, thank you for investing in Africa, because you are creating jobs in Africa. But instead of thanking China for investing in Africa, the Europeans have shown their geopolitical incompetence by slapping China, criticizing China for investing in Africa. So this is a classic case of shooting yourself in your own foot when you criticize China. So I find when I listen to the European leaders like Elizabeth von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, or Annalena Baerbock, the former foreign minister of Germany, I find that they don't step back and do a very rational, pragmatic, long-term strategic calculation of what are Europe's interests in the long run and what should Europe do to protect itself in the long run. So I'm actually, in some ways, the best friend that Europe has, because I'm trying to tell the Europeans, look at your own interests, and your own interests dictate that you should not necessarily take the side of the United States against China, because your interest, geopolitics is a combination of two words, geography and politics. And because the geography of Europe is different from the geography of the United States, it makes sense for Europe to say, okay, when it comes to our geography, we need to work with China to create jobs in Africa, right? And not join the United States in blocking Chinese investments in Africa. And in some ways, Donald Trump should be seen as a gift to Europe. Because Donald Trump is saying, my mission is not to make Europe great again. My mission is MAGA, to make America great again. And so Europe should say, okay, if your mission is to make America great again, our mission is to make Europe great again. And therefore, Europeans should become more pragmatic in the way that they handle their geopolitical issues. But as Henry Kissinger told me in his last one-on-one conversation, the quality of mind of European leaders has gone down a lot. And they're not able to engage in long-term strategic thinking in the way that previous generations of leaders could do so.
Well, the United States was also very successful in building these transatlantic ties and actually fostering a lot of European leaders who view more value in continuing the transatlantic ties and strengthening the US than strengthening their own domestic capacities, which is a tragedy. But let's put that aside. Do you think that this will come back into balance over long or short, or do you foresee, especially for Europe, more turmoil ahead?
There was a famous British statesman, Lord Palmerston, I think his name was, who said that countries don't have permanent friends, they don't have permanent enemies, they only have permanent interests. Now, in the Cold War, there was it wasn't the values that brought United States and European Union together. There was a convergence of interests. Both felt equally threatened by the Soviet Union. And they say, okay, if you have a common enemy, you cooperate, right? The Soviet Union was right there at the border of Europe. In fact, Soviet tanks were very close to Germany. So it made sense for Germany to form a close alliance with the United States of America. Now, China is 12,000 kilometers. There's a gap between Brussels and Beijing is 12,000 kilometers or more. China is not a threat to Europe. So, so in that case, if you want to look after your own interests, as by the way, Donald Trump is actually, to be fair to him, looking after American interests very well, right? He's taking care of American interests. So I think
certain parts.
So therefore, Europe should also learn to take care of its own interests and decide where its interests converge and where its interests diverge. Because in the long run, geopolitical alliances are not based on values; they are based on interests, as Lord Palmerston said. And the European Union needs to do a complete strategic reboot and figure out where its interests lie. Because without doing the strategic reboot, the Europeans are making mistakes. For example, there's Susan Glasser, a New Yorker writer. She wrote recently that the current European policy is one of practicing strategic self-abasement. Now, that's in her words, strategic self-abasement. Now, strategic self-abasement means kowtowing. Now, you never get the respect of anyone when you kowtow. So the Europeans should therefore work out their own independent foreign policy and not rely just only on, relying on others to save their interests.
Your words, Ambassador, in the ears of the Europeans, or the European Union at least. I have to be very mindful of your time, and I thank you very much for speaking to us. People who want to follow you, is there a place where you regularly publish your analysis?
Well, I mean, I have a website, www.mamubani.net, but I also have Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Substack.
Okay. I will put.
I have all. They can turn to any one of them.
I will put the links to all of them into the description of this video below. Sure. Ambassador Mahbubani, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
大家好，我是主播周玉琴。很多的朋友告诉我们，太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌帮助了睡眠品质。有季节敏感、代谢困扰、关心异常细胞风险的好朋友呢，可以选择原版的太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌，它添加有超级食物羽衣甘蓝，健康再加分。而有睡眠困扰的朋友们，赶快选择蓝色包装这一款晚安加强版，绝对是更有感。每日克菲尔，时刻美好 ，Good Feel Good， 请上快点购为健康下单，而且要记得输入推荐代码，有额外的折扣优惠。太阳星全效克菲尔益生菌基础版、晚安加强版，新包装改版，内容不变，抽取更方便，要吃就吃最好的。